Okay, we're going to start in Romans chapter 1 again. This will finish out Romans chapter 1. We are looking especially at verse 29, 30, 31, yet at the same time we're going to start with some of the thoughts in 24. But we're going to start the whole thing in Romans chapter 1, verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hinder the truth in unrighteousness. So Paul starts out by saying, we're going to be talking about all of the ungodliness and unrighteousness. All of that has been revealed from heaven. So what is your source of morality? What is your source of worship? What is your source of spirituality? It's important that you get it from heaven and only from heaven. And then in verse 19, he says that God was made manifest. Verse 20, I think, is a vitally important passage. And I've noticed this, whenever you talk with an atheist and you do something like this, well, in Romans chapter 1, well, you can't put the Bible in there. You can't use the Bible to prove your point. Wait a minute. Romans chapter 1, verse 20 is truth, whether the Bible says it or not. It is a basic principle of life. And it's important to keep in mind. We take notice also of Romans 1:21, Romans 1:22 and 23. 22, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Verse 23, they changed the glory of the incorruptible God for the likeness of an image of corruptible man. Now, I want you to put your finger there, and when we get over to verse 25, for that they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the creator. So here is the point that I would try to put across in verse 18 and following, and that is that Paul addresses two issues. They exchanged the image of God, what we are worshiping, and they exchanged the service of God, what we do in relationship to our God, what God has told us to do in life as far as godliness and righteousness. They will exchange that or change that for something else. They will change that for what they want instead of what God has said. And he tells you exactly what he's talking about. He doesn't tell you everything that needs to be told. Y'all won't let me do that on a Sunday, or we would have been here the first time we were in Romans chapter 1. We'd have been here for 12 hours. But be that as it may, here we have Paul letting it be known. They exchange the truth of God for a lie. So here you have the truth from God as to what he wants, how to serve him, how to worship him, how to live godly, and then we have lies. We have to understand that there are lies in religion. There are lies in the world. Now, he does cover in verse 26 and 27 a specific sin that is even here today, and he says that they exchange or they have given themselves up to vile passions, and then he names what it is. Women with women. They changed the natural use. In verse 27, they've exchanged the natural use of men, and men burned with men. So that would be one of the basic problems of America today. It's not a problem among the Muslims. You don't go into the Muslim world and protest their view of homosexuality, but you can do it in America. And you can be so godly and virtue signal by being against homosexuality, but being for homosexuality, be against those that say anything at all or even quote the Bible. But you go into a Muslim country, it's a different story. You do not get much said whenever you go against and protest what they believe. Verse 28, they refused to have God in their knowledge. God rejected them into reprobate mind. Verse 29, here we go. Being filled with all unrighteousness. Now he names and he gives a list. What I'm going to do is go through these, and then we're going to come back through them and discuss 1 or 2 or 6 or 12 of them. Someone says, Ron, there's only 23. I know. Looking at verse 29, he talks about unrighteousness, the injustice, that which is unfair, that which is dishonest dealings. He talks about in the King James, and I believe it ought to be put in the American Standard Translation and all the rest of them, fornication. We're going to really look at that word. We have wickedness, which indicates vicious disposition with evil habits. People just are wicked. That's one of the hardest things for me to get in my mind, is to realize that some people in this world are just wicked. They're just. He talks about covetousness, which is a greedy desire, using evil means sometimes to even get what you're trying to get from someone. Maliciousness, hatred and ill will, a disposition to do evil or harm. Full of envy. We're going to be looking at that as well. Begrudging the good fortune of others. You don't necessarily want it. You just don't want them to get it. Murder. And it's important that we see the word murder. I heard an excellent definition in contrast to killing. It was good. We need to keep it in mind whether we discuss it or not today. Debate. Now, what you have in the King James is the word debate. When you're looking at the American Standards and other modern versions, you will use the word and see this word strife. The basic idea is there is a distinction. There is a distinction between debating somebody and quarreling with somebody. We ought not to quarrel with people. We ought to try our best to avoid quarreling. And when we see that we're caught up in it, we need to run away from it as quickly as we can. On the other hand, debating, there's nothing wrong with giving the reasons for what you believe. There's nothing wrong with arguing. When properly defining, argue. Now, of course, language changes. And in the English language today, whenever you hear someone say, well, I'm not going to argue with you, there's a variety of meanings with that word, arguing. I had fun with a young man that I think a lot of. We're driving along on the highway one day, and we're talking biblical. And he says, well, I don't want to argue with you. It's been my experience that people who don't want to argue with you are really saying, I don't want to discuss the issue that you brought up that I know nothing about. So we went along for 10, 15 minutes, and I said to him, after he made an assertion, I said, that's not true. And we went into an argument for 10 minutes. And then I said, oh, I guess you don't mind arguing when you're right. And his face just lit up and he understood what I was pointing at. And so there's nothing wrong with arguing when you define it as giving the reasons for what you believe. There's a lot wrong with it when you're using the word argument from the sense of quarreling. Debating and arguing is nothing wrong. Then you have malignity, a bad manner of life or character. They're just bad people. They're evil. According to Aristotle, and Aristotle and I, we used to talk all the time. He was a nice guy. Aristotle says it is a disposition to take everything in the worst sense. Have you ever known anybody like that? You'd be talking to them, and all of a sudden, what you thought was neutral has become evil. What you thought was positive has become evil. Everything is evil. We go further. Whisperers, secretly peddling slander by insinuation. Proverbs 16:28, a perverse man scattereth abroad strife, and a whisper separateth chief friends. And I would call a name right now, but I'm not going to. We're looking now at verse 30. Backbiters, one who slanders another when he's not present. Did you see whisperers? Did you see backbiters? A backbiter goes behind your back and he whispers about you. He talks about you. A whisperer, he may be standing in front of you far away, but you're not hearing him. And they will peddle slander against you. We have haters of God. God haters defy God and defy his law. Despiteful, says the King James. Insolent, says the American Standard. Contemptuous and grossly disrespectful. We're going to be looking at James Dobson in just a moment. And he points out that respect is something that is intended to go two ways. And this is important when it comes to teenagers, young people, and parents. There needs to be a respect for the person you're talking to, whether they're young or old. And let me say that a little louder for Shane. We need to have respect for those older people that you talk to. We go further and we take notice of proud, haughty, arrogant, thinking too highly of themselves. Boastful, sounds about the same. Empty pretender, vainglorious estimate of himself. Inventors of evil things. Old ways become dull, so they think of new ways to do old things. Disobedient to parents. A lack of basic respect for authority from the youth. It has a lot to do with being disobedient to parents. Verse 31. Without understanding, without good sense, foolish. Now, covenant breakers, they will not honor their agreements. They make agreements and then they break those agreements. When we went over to Russia back in the 1990s, Cliff and I noticed as we went around the backside of the legislature, the Red Square, our fellow Yuri, who was our guide, but not supposed to be our guide, he would tell us certain things along the way. And what I concluded was every time that Russia made an agreement with a nation, it seemed like that nation broke that agreement. Now, that's from a Russian's standpoint. I don't know how true that is because I haven't looked at the Russian history all that closely. But the fact is that covenant breakers, whether it is in marriage or whether it's in a job or whether it's wherever it might be, you have those people who break those covenants. We are noticing without natural affection, without love for kindred, our family, parents, children, so forth. Implacable. I've heard that pronounced two different ways. I like implacable. An unforgiving temperament. You're too stubborn to accept reconciliation and make agreement with somebody. It's not that you can't. Sometimes you can't. It's the fact that you won't. That's implacable. Unmerciful. No sympathy or pity, without kindness or mercy. What I want you to take notice of is those five, if you're reading the King James, those five are specially formulated words. Paul is using a literary device in which he takes a positive word, family, love of family, storge, love of family, and he brings into it an alpha privative. What's that mean? It's a prefix. It's an alpha. It's an A. In Greek, it's an A, not an A, an alpha. And you put that on a positive word, and it makes it just the opposite. You've heard comedians say, he is the funniest man in the world. Not. Well, the not just made it the opposite of what he stated. The Apostle Paul is not using a not, but is using a not like concept. And that is that he has put a alpha on the beginning of a word and changed it. So you have love of family with an alpha and its lack of love for family. Let's look a little closer at the word fornication in verse 29. I always stop and do this because I never know who hears me for the first time. The English dictionaries and a number of preachers, whenever they look at the word fornication and the word adultery, they make a distinction like this, and it's incorrect. Fornication is unwedded fulfillment of sexual desires. Adultery is unlawful fulfillment of sexual desires of a married person. So with adultery, their definition means a person has to be married. On the other hand, with fornication, they're not married. Unwedded sexual fulfillment. Back in the 70s, we were 80s. We were worshiping at the Owasso Church of Christ, and just 10, 20 miles north was the Collinsville congregation, where a young lady sued the church because they withdrew fellowship from her for committing adultery. And the lawyer, who was secular, not religious, he made a big play on the idea of adultery. Well, he was using the word adultery the way that you would use it in a courtroom and the way that you would use it with most people. And that is, she was having fulfilling her sexual desires with a married person. And he made it clear, the lawyer did, that the man was not married, but they were separated. Be that as it may, that was the distinction that was being made. I want to properly define fornication. The very first definition is prostitution, including adultery and incest. Now, there is more than that to it. I got a creepy crawler crawling down the wall. What it is, she can't see the temperature. So, from the Greek dictionary, even from the Greek dictionary, it will tell you that the word fornication does include adultery. Fornication is the opposite gender fulfillment of sexual desires. It is the same gender fulfillment of sexual desires, which we covered in verse 24 through 27. It is the fulfillment of sexual desires directed toward children, which is a big issue in America today for some reason. It is also the fulfillment of sexual desires directed toward animals. It is also included in the idea of rape. In 2 Samuel 13, you had a young man by the name of Ammon, son of David. And you had a young man by the name of Absalom, a son of David. Absalom had a sister by the name of Tamar. Ammon loved Tamar. Yes, they were half sisters, half kinfolk. He loved her. He loved her greatly. I'm not going into the full detail, but here's what he did. He feigned like he was sick. And he said, "Send Tamar to take care of me while I'm sick." Well, Tamar was glad to do that. She liked Ammon, and you can tell that from a number of things. But she was a righteous young lady. Ammon was lying. He was not sick. He was trying to get Tamar in his bed, and he did by force. He raped her. And after that, verse 15 of 2 Samuel, he hated her as much as he loved her. What a contrast. Ammon was a sorry, sorry individual. In this particular context, Romans 1:29, Paul is not using fornication to refer to spiritual idolatry, such as is found in Revelation 17:2. I'll not go into that, but you catch the point. There is the marital unfaithfulness, and there's the spiritual unfaithfulness. Turning to Colossians chapter 3, verse 5, we're now looking at the word covetousness. Colossians 3:5. And very quickly, Paul writes, as he's talking about seek those things that are above, not the things that are on the earth. He says, "Put to death, therefore, your members which are upon the earth, fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry." Which is idolatry. Vincent says it secures the affections which belong to God. It is therefore idolatry. Lightfoot says the covetous man sets up another object of worship besides God, and that's why it would be called idolatry. Our next word is full of envy. Full of envy. I don't know whether you did or not, but when I read the word envy, 99 times out of 98, I think of two different situations with envy. The first thing I think of is Joseph. He's got 11 brothers. One of them is too young to do all of this, but Reuben, the older, and the other brothers, they got together and they said, let's kill him. Instead, Reuben said, no, let's throw him in a pit. Let's sprinkle some animal blood on his coat of many colors, and let's tell Daddy's dead. And then they sell him into Egyptian bondage. They did that because they envied. They did not necessarily want what he had. They didn't want him to have what he had. That's the idea of envy. And then the second example, I'm going to use Mark 15, 9 through 11. You have the rulers who crucified Christ. And Mark would point out Pilate's perception of the mob as they would cry for the blood of Christ to be crucified. Mark 15, 9. Pilate answered to them, saying, will ye that I release unto you the King of the Jews? For he perceived that for envy the chief priest had delivered him up. But the chief priest stirred up the multitude that he should rather release Barabbas unto them. So what went through Pilate's mind is, this man is innocent. He said that even. He's not guilty of anything. The governor said he's not guilty of anything. My wife said he's not guilty of anything. And so you can see in Mark chapter 15 that you can tell when somebody has this jealousy, but it goes further than just jealousy. It means you don't want them to have what they've got. Our next word is found in verse 29. It's the word deceit. We're going to say quite a bit about deceit. It's the major weapon that false teachers use. Jesus, when he finished and near the end of the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew 7:15, said this, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravening wolves. Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father. It's important for us to emphasize he that doeth the will of the Father. There are those who are saying, Lord, Lord, they believe in the Lord. John 12:42. There are believers who will not do what the Lord said. These folks, they're simply saying they will not do the will of the Father. Verse 22. Did we not prophesy by thy name cast out demons, by thy name do many mighty works? And he said, I will profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye worker, ye that work iniquity. So you have the ravening wolves, and they would try to deceive the people. Turn with me now to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. 2 Corinthians 11. Deceit started in the garden. Verse 3. But I fear, lest by any means, as the serpent beguiled, deceived Eve through his subtlety, so your minds should be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. For if he that cometh preacheth another Jesus, whom we have not preached, or if you receive another spirit which you have not received, or another gospel which you have not accepted, you might well bear with them. Now, what he's done is using irony, sarcasm, in order to make his point. So he says this, there are those who would come unto you and they would bring a different Jesus. Now, when we preach Christ, he said, when we preach Christ, you don't accept us. When we lay our hands on you and you receive the miraculous gifts, 2 Corinthians 12, 1 Corinthians 9, 1 Corinthians 12. When we lay our hands on you, you receive the spiritual gifts that was given in the first century. That came from us, the Apostle Paul. And when we tell you about the Word of God, the gospel of Christ, you reject it. But when somebody comes preaching a different Jesus to you, you bear with him. When someone comes and talks about a different spirit than the one we've talked about, you bear with him. Whenever somebody comes with a whole different gospel, you bear with him. You put up with those things. So Paul says, somebody's deceiving you. Christianity is simple. Christianity is simple. What does the book say? Not what does the book not say? What does the book say? Over the past number of decades, we have had nations who have gained the full knowledge of those who would deceive. David may recognize what I'm about to say. When this young lady was a high school sophomore, she said, my world history teacher, Granny Holloway, taught us world history. She was a slight woman, scarcely 5 feet tall, seemingly frail, but full of vim, vigor, vitality. She could speak for hours about the fall of the Roman Empire, the Inquisition, the Industrial Revolution, and world wars. She never sat while she lectured. She moved around the room, making eye contact with all the students. She was demanding. I can't remember how many papers were sent back to me because she would note, you can do better than this. One day during class, an office aide interrupted her lecture to hand her a note. She read it silently, apologized, and said that she needed to leave the room. We knew it had to be important because Granny Holloway stopped lecturing for no one. We sat in the room talking one to another when the door opened and Mrs. Abels walked in, another teacher in the high school. She explained to us that Granny had been faced with an emergency, a serious one, and it was questionable if she would even return during the finish out the semester. We were stunned. Would we not get a chance to say goodbye? Would we get updates? We needed to know if she was okay. Mrs. Abels assured us that we need not worry, that Granny was safe, but needed time away. And the best thing that we could do for her and the best way we could show her our devotion to her was to be cooperative with her with her replacement. Mrs. Abels then confirmed that she was the replacement. Cheer up, she told the students. This could be a good thing. Other teachers still believed in endless homework and projects with deadlines and hard work. She would not bring that into our class. She believed in clean slates. If there were any grades that we did not like, she would give us a chance to change them and bring them up. She asked us what suggestions we had to make the semester a better learning experience. Someone mentioned the lectures were boring. We wanted more films. Done, she said. Someone else mentioned that a free day now and then would help us if we needed to catch up work in other classes. That's fine. I don't have any problem with that, she said. She asked us how we felt about end of semester having a semester party. Yeah, sounded pretty good. And on Mrs. Abels listed and listened intently and agreed to all of our suggestions, continually emphasizing that her concern was that to have a good learning experience and an enjoyable semester. She also reminded us that we were lucky not to be sent out to other classes where we would be working to catch up our grades. So, near the end of the period, shortly before the bell rang, the door opened and Granny Holloway sauntered in with her usual Granny Holloway attitude. And she said to the Mrs. Abels, how did they do? Marvelous, said Mrs. Abels. They were completely in my hands. Granny then faced and said to us, that, my students, is how a dictator takes over a nation. Not with guns or tanks or laws or mandates. They do it using false promises and gifts. The writer of this article made this observation. I can't remember a lesson all through 12 years of public school that made such an impression on me and has stayed with me. We were among wolves in sheep clothing. Many are being deceived today. Stay awake and buckle up. I thought Wayne Price gave us an excellent example of nations being deceived. Now, Granny Holloway was not trying to deceive them. She was trying to teach them a lesson. Listen closely. There's a distinction between telling an untruth and then exposing that untruth in order to teach a lesson. The Bible has a number of them. But to tell an untruth, to practice an untruth, in order to bring about a different outcome than what truth would bring, is deception and wrong. We turn our attention to haters of God. I've called your attention more than once to the fact that I've been listening to a number of atheists, and a few of them, I'll give you one of them, what he had to say. A few of them have expressed a disgust with God, the God of the Bible, a hatred towards the God of the Bible, a total lack of respect to what God has said, defying his laws and his thoughts and his precepts and his concepts. Here's one particular fellow that I found out when I was reading that he used to preach the gospel that he now turned against. And he said this, and a number of atheists say it. If I die, and if I end up before the throne of God, I will actually believe in God at that time. But simply because there's a God that I believe in does not mean I would respect or admire a God who would create something like hell to send someone like me to. So the point that he's making has been made a dozen times. The God of the Bible has made a hell. And since there is a hell, then he can't be the God I would serve. That's your choice. So what you're doing is you're leaving out justice. What you're doing is leaving this. Evil wins. Evil wins if there is no justice. Furthermore, you leave out the fact you're saying that you know more than God. Here's what we have to understand. There has to be a reason that God has done what he did. Simply because he didn't tell us what he's doing, why hell, why create us knowing that we would sin, what's he going to do totally and completely, what all is involved in all of that. Simply because he doesn't tell us everything doesn't mean he's got an outstanding godly reason. Job chapter 40 and following. Job was told by God, here, take the robes of a judge, as God would say to Job. Now you judge. Would you annul one of my laws, concepts, precepts? And after you annul one of them, do you have the power to change things? Furthermore, do you have the knowledge? And that's what I'm trying to say to us. We do not have the knowledge of God. Atheists do not have the knowledge of God. They have some of the knowledge of God because he told them. But God is God. We're now looking at the next item, and that is insolence, disobedient to parents. As the twig is bent, so grows the tree, the English poet Alexander Pope would say. Authority is God ordained, said James Dobson, who is an expert in kids and family, lacking in Bible knowledge. But authoritarianism and raw power in almost all forms is dangerous. A boy or girl, he said, who knows that love abounds at home will not resent well-deserved punishment. One who is unloved or ignored will hate any form of discipline. I'm going to call this parenting by Proverbs. You've heard painting by numbers. Well, this is parenting by Proverbs, and I'm not going to have time to say everything. Proverbs 1:8. Proverbs 1:8. My son, hear the instruction of thy father. Forsake not the law of thy mother. Chapter 6:20. Chapter 6:20. My son, keep thy father's commandment. Forsake not the law of thy mother. 22:6. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. That's not true 100%. It's a basic principle that is true. It's a proverb. Proverbs 13:24. He that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chastiseth him betimes, diligently, early in life. Proverbs 23:13. Withhold not correction from the child, for if thou beatest him with a rod, he shall not die. Shane is alive today because I would beat him when he was young. Now, first of all, you have to look at the word beat. There are people who are trying to find ways to do the opposite of what God has said do. There are fathers who are cruel to their children, and they misunderstand, especially something like this. The rod of correction has been stated. You're using a rod that corrects, not a rod that is cruel and harsh and mean. Yes, it will inflict some pain, but it's not the type that you beat a child to a pulp. There's a vast, vast difference in what the Bible is saying concerning smiting a child and inflicting pain on the child. There's a number of passages we could look at to show that the word is to smite. So if you've got a King James or any other that's using the word beat, put the word smite. And bear in mind, it's the rod of correction, the rod of correction, something young men need to learn early in life. If thou beatest him, he will not die. There are two ways to interpret that. If you beat him, he's not going to die from that. The other way is, if you beat him, he will correct his life, and his life will be a good life, and he will be righteous, and he will not die eternally. In chapter 19, verse 18, chasten thy son while there is hope, and let not my soul spare for his crime. So you chastise a child young. He won't die, that's true, but you'll keep him from dying later because there's still hope in the child. A dozen and one other passages. Last of all, with the 25 minutes I have left, chapter 31, without understanding. And we compare verse 1, verse 22 as well. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. That word fools is the word that is basically pronounced moron. Now, the word moron has changed meanings over the years, so don't get caught up in it being something that is demeaning to another person. The English definition is a person whose intellectual development proceeds normally up to about the 8th year of life and is then arrested so that there is little or no further development. That's what a moron, that's the meaning of it in 1828 as was used at that time. Now, moron has changed meanings, and there is a more meaning to it than that. When a person of age asks the question, where did God come from? It shows that he fails to understand the nature of God. When a person understands God is God, he does not ask the question, where did God come from? because by the true meaning of God, it indicates that he is omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent, infinite. He is those things. And if he's not those things, he's not God. If at one time there was no God, where did your God come from? If at one time there was no God, then there was God, then he's not God. Mankind has three choices. Nothing created everything, a big rock created everything, or a supreme superior intellect, omnipotent, omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, infinite. Richard Dawkins hates everything about God. He emphasizes, because it fits his narrative, that everything began from simplicity. Folks, Richard Dawkins is a smart man, but he's without understanding. And he has to have everything start from simplicity. A big rock existed, and water fell on that rock, and voila, we have the complex of today. Simplicity to complex. That's his view. On the other hand, Romans 1:20, the view that has evidence for it is that you start with complexity. Every house has a builder. When you look at the universe, when you look at the heavens, when you look at the galaxy, when you look at all the things, when you look at space, someone of complex capability had to create that complexity. That did not come from simplicity. Where did God come from? Well, a bigger God created God. Well, the bigger God, where did he come from? Well, a bigger God created a bigger God who created God. Do you see the problem and the issue? It's a lack of understanding of God. I'll stop there.